process of democratization. These substantive issues are classified into two categories. The first category consists of the factors that affect democratization. These, which we shall be discussing today, include the historical factor of colonial security policy, which we touched on last week, and the post-colonial politics, which unfortunately generated was the post-colonial by the colonial security policy. The other factor is the sociological factor, such as ethnic demography and cultural norms. The other one is the level of economic development, whether or not it affects the process of democratization. But the most important factor, in my opinion, is the autonomy of civil society, or its evolution and separation from the state. These are the factors we shall look at in our this part of the program. Last week I described the basic elements of the colonial security policy, whose main components were the criteria for recruiting security forces from minority, ethnic, or religious groups who were deployed far from their homes, and if circumstances warranted, carried out what they called, under colonial rule, punishing expeditions. We also saw that after independence, the post-colonial regimes adopted the colonial security policies. In fact, the post-colonial regimes did far more than adopting the colonial security policies. In the case of Uganda, we saw how Obote recruited and politicized the army in order to achieve his political objectives, such as the war and the attack on the Ruviri in 1966 by Idi Amin. Obote also created a hybrid force known as the Special Force, which he used to achieve his political objectives, especially as we illustrated in the Nakrabi incident, or Nakrabi massacre. And Obote II, during the insurgency war, Obote II also used the special force as part of the army to fight the insurgents, and used it to kidnap innocent people in the Ruel Triangle. In addition to the special force, Obote created the General Service Unit, headed by Akena Doko in 1964. The General Service Unit was a special force without uniform. The Special Force and the General Service Unit were both engaged in the same business of intimidating the population and to create pathological fear of the state within the population of Uganda. We can therefore refer to colonial security policy and its adoption, modification, and intensification after independence as state terrorism. In fact, the theme today is state terrorism, as it will become clear during this conversation. Now, I guess the listeners can understand why we say that these policies were factors designed to prevent democracy from taking root in Africa. The creation of pathological fear of the state is one of the most effective ways to frustrate and even prevent democratization, because a psychologically paralyzed population is incapable of demanding the enjoyment of its human rights. The process of deprogramming the population to overcome pathological fear of the state is a tough one and often requires either a revolutionary change in the way people view their human rights, or a slow process of social change that gradually transforms the mentality of the people from being psychological prisoners in their thinking about their human rights, of as free individuals who are rationally capable of confronting the state and demand the enjoyment of their human rights at any price. At this point, let me summarize part of the conversation last week for the benefit of those who did not listen. First, we analyzed the colonial security policy. Clearly, the implication of the colonial security policy amounted to state terrorism. It included a show of force by armed forces from minority ethnic or religious groups, which carried out punishing expeditions. What I did not make explicit last week is the fact that the British, who were by all means fanatic believers in legality, had a principle by which they enforced colonial law and policies. The British had a principle known as law, order, and good government. This principle was the equivalent of the principle of rule of law. Obviously, rule of law could not apply under the colonial conditions because it required the equality of all people under the law and a judicial decision before enforcement of any breach of the laws, and the court's decision before anybody could be deprived of life, liberty, and property. Under the principle of law, order, and good government, the existence of order depended on a classification of the colonial subjects according to race, or on one hand, and ethnicity on the other. Different racial groups enjoyed different rights under colonial law. Colonial administration was organized along ethnic lines. These rules were premised on what colonial administrators considered to be good government, designed to achieve what was considered law and order. The punishing expedition, for example, was justified in the name of enforcing law, order, and maintaining good government. Its purpose was to pacify an area in the colonial territory in order to restore order. Ironically, post-colonial state terrorism was not different from colonial terrorism. under which law was enforced through the creation of pathological fear of the state. After independence, the post-colonial regimes substituted the principle of rule of law with the principle of state security. State security became the primary goal of the post-colonial regimes in the 1960s. The proliferation of intelligence agencies, whose primary purpose was to cause pathological fear of the state, can finally be explained in plain English. The rationalization and justification of state terrorism after independence led to the enactment of the detention laws in Ghana, in Uganda, and Kenya. In Uganda, in 1967, the Parliament enacted the Public Order and Security Act in the wake of the 1966 crisis. It was a law, ironically, intended to strengthen and enforce the 1967 Constitution and to fight political enemies who were agents of imperialism. Those of you who were old enough in the 60s may remember Akena Doko's debates with Ali Mazrui and Picho Ali in City Hall in Kampala. Under Obote 1, as we saw, the Special Force and the General Service Unit were political instruments for state terrorism. Now let us look at Obote's bloody rule. Under Obote 2, Obote created another security agency known as NASA, or the National Security Agency. NASA was the general service by another name. However, NASA was a much better equipped and modernized intelligence agency than the General Service Unit. The agents of NASA were relatively young and enthusiastic to do their nefarious work. They were equipped with a database stored in computers, which led to their being nicknamed the Computer Boys. Technology added a new dimension with which the Computer Boys executed their terroristic activities. The boss of the Computer Boys was Dr. Luuriza Kirunda, the Minister of Internal Affairs. This was a man who was driven more by political rage than rational and cool implementation of state security policy. The minister gave the Computer Boys a blank check to arrest and detain the political opponents of the regime under the Public Order and Security Act 1967 without first seeking his authority as law required him to do. Members of Parliament in the opposition, like Professor Yoweri Chesimira, were not spared by Luuriza's outrageous and pathological political act. For example, Chesimira was a member of Parliament, and he was arrested and detained from the parliamentary buildings themselves. The issued an order to release Chesimira, but Ruiza Chirunda defied the court orders with impunity. Moreover, the Chief Justice, Masika, was a UPC diehard. So you can see here that there was a breakdown of what we call institutional checks and balances, which we incorporated as component number 5 in the definition of democracy. Having looked at Obote's blood rule, now let us look briefly at Amin's reign of terror. The first thing Amin did when he captured power was to destroy Obote's General Service Unit and replace it with his own intelligence agencies, named the State Research Bureau and the National Safety Unit. The State Research Bureau was the most feared intelligence agency in the history of Uganda, which, for Amin's laconic humor, he named State Research. The State Research Bureau was neither a bureau nor a research institute. Consisting of about 3,000 brutal agents, the State Research Bureau had the power to arrest, detain, torture, interrogate, and ultimately, as was the case in 90% of the cases, execute the victim and secretly dispose of the body. Such was the fate of the Chief Justice Benedict Kiwanuka, the Vice Chancellor of Makerere, Frank Kalimuzo, and the Anglican Archbishop of Uganda, Jayana Luwumu, who, just to mention a few. Now, if those prominent people could suffer with impunity under the State Research Bureau, you can imagine what would happen to lesser mortals like all the rest of the population of Uganda. Estimates of the number of people killed during Amin's 9 years of reign of terror range from 100,000 to 500,000 people. The efficiency with which the State Research Bureau operated was astounding. They could arrest their victims from every corner of the country in one day. They could kidnap their victims in broad daylight while people were watching and put them in the trunk of the car for transportation to their certain destiny of death at the headquarters of the State Research Bureau at Nakasero, just next to the Presidential Lodge. And it is believed that there were tunnels connecting the headquarters of the State Research Bureau to the President's Lodge in Nakasero. So the victims of the State Research Bureau who were in Nakasero, we understand, and there is documentation of this, were starved to death. Otherwise, an execution with a pistol bullet through the head would suffice to end the misery and suffering of a terrified victim of State Research Bureau. These facts are well documented in human rights journals and publications and the media. The State Research Bureau agents, in fact, made sure that the public knew about the fate of their victims, although they were very careful to make sure that no individual agent of the State Research Bureau could be identified as responsible for any specific death. For example, Ben Kiwanuka, Frank Kalimuzo, and Archbishop Luwum were killed by these agents. But there is no knowledge I am aware of the agents that were responsible for murdering these people, although prominent people as they were. So the State Research Bureau agents were very, very shrewd in hiding their tracks and disappearing in the night after doing their dirty work. The policy of creating fear of the state, pathological fear of the state, was deliberate. And it was intended to send a chilling message to the public at large, not to mess around with the government headed by His Excellency Dr. Idi Amin Dada, CBE, or Commander of the British Empire, as he used to call himself. The brutal tactic of the State Research Bureau actually worked very well and efficiently. The result was a Ugandan population numbed by pathological fear of the State Research Bureau. If ever the state had to be feared, the State Research Bureau was the most effective messenger to deliver the bad news written in blood. Now, let us look at briefly at the second intelligence agency created, which is the National Safety Unit. Amin, whose brutality knew no limits, also created another intelligence agency, the unit ironically named the National Safety Unit. It was headquartered at Naguru, a suburb of Kampala City. The National Safety Unit had everything but safety in it for the citizens of Uganda. It was a reincarnation of terror itself. The National Safety Unit had power under the law enacted by decree to shoot and kill suspected quote-unquote robbers on sight. A robber apparently was a person who desired freedom, security, and openly criticized the government headed by Idi Amin about such issues, either openly or privately. It didn't matter how you did it. The methods of execution at the National Safety Unit headquarters at Naguru were beyond brutality by any measure. They were designed to strike terror in the hearts of all the citizens of Uganda. Victims were lined up. The one at the end of the line was given a heavy hammer, which he used to crush the head of the victim next to him. His job accomplished, he was the next victim to be executed by the next victim in the same manner. This continued until the last victim was shot in the head by the commander of the unit at the National Safety Unit, so-called National Safety Unit. Knowledge of these cruel methods of the execution was widespread in the population of Uganda. The sole purpose of this brutality was to cause pathological fear of the state so that no individual would dare dream or entertain an idea of overthrowing Idi Amin from power. The trick worked for a while, but even pathological fear of the state had its limits. Ugandans, aided by Tanzanian army, attacked and overthrew Idi Amin on April 11, 1979. The rest is, so to speak, history. Now, lastly, let me look briefly at what I call NRM terror machine. When NRM came to power, they enacted a law under which the three security agencies were created, namely ISO, or Internal Security Organization, ESO, or External Security Organization, and MIC, or Military Intelligence Chieftains, whose head, the General Sejusa Otinyafuza, recently defected and cowardly lives in exile in hiding. If we go by what he revealed, that is, Tinyafuza revealed in an interview with the Voice of America, the agencies General Tinyafuza used to head are as terroristic as those under Idi Amin and Obote. General Tinyafuza revealed in the interview that if he made the mistake of returning to Uganda today, there were plans already to arrest him and kill him, and then make the situation of his death appear as if he died in a crossfire in an attempt by his supporters to rescue him. In simple language, his death would be staged or acted out for purposes of publicity and disinformation. If this is true, and I have no reason to question the credibility of Tinyafuza's narrative, then NRM regime is not different from those of Obote and Amin we have described in detail above. Bishop Lum's death was staged by Amin's State Research Bureau. Mutesa II's death in London 1969 is also believed to have been staged by the General Service Unit. Just like under Amin and Obote, the UPDF is both politicized and ethnically controlled. Instead of the State Research Bureau and the National Safety Unit under Amin, or the General Service Unit and the NASA under Obote, we have ISO, ESO, and MIC, which use safe houses to torture political opponents, such as Kalundi Serumaga in 2009. ISO is the agency responsible for intimidation during elections, and its activities are documented in the two cases of Besigye versus Museveni, which were brought before the Supreme Court in 2001 and 2006. I've read these cases, and the evidence is unequivocal, and it is there. The ISO is also responsible for the deaths during 2009 riots and Kasubi's shooting, which was directed by Mohoz in the very presence of his father. Now, this concludes what I call state terrorism. You can see that state terrorism is designed to cause pathological fear of the state, and that fear is intended to prevent the people from rising up against the state to demand their rights. In other words, that is a major, state terrorism is a major factor in preventing democratization. As I've shown you now, the population in Uganda is very scared of the state, and they if you call them to come out and demonstrate, they will say no. And the explanation is very easy. It is because through the history from the colonial time through Obote 1 and Obote 2 and Amin, and now under NRM, the state is causing pathological fear to prevent the liberation of the people to enjoy their human rights. So this is why I say we have to deprogram the population of Uganda and liberate it from this pathological fear, because the fear actually which the people have is unrealistic. The reason why I call it pathological fear, it's because it is not normal fear. Normal fear is expected. We all have created, every living thing is created with some form of fear in order to preserve its life. But when fear is pathological, it means that it is beyond reasoning, that the people are rendered fearful of a situation to which they think there is no solution. And this we have to confront, and we have to educate the people, and we have to change society to remove this pathological fear if we want to liberate the Ugandans from dictatorship. Now, let me look at another factor, which is ethnic demography. We may distinguish the political factors of using and manipulating the army discussed above in this conversation from the sociological factors by looking at the motives of the actors, whereas the political factors, as we have presented them here, are motivated by personal political objectives of the leader. For example, the sociological factors tend to unite groups with a common understanding and to bring them together in order to collectively influence the results or in their favor, or share the rewards from the entire political system. So the two sociological factors which have already affected the democratization in Uganda are ethnicity and its demography. That is, the size of the ethnic group is as important as the group itself. Thus, these two factors are in fact closely related and sometimes inseparable, but nevertheless distinctive in their impact on democratization of the political system. The history of post-colonial Uganda illustrates these two points very, very, very well. Ethnicity, which we have referred to as a factor in colonial and post-colonial military policies, mainly used minorities and their role in politicizing the armed forces. The large ethnic groups which were excluded from the army had the numbers to influence political results in a democratic electoral process. What the large ethnic groups lacked in military power, they compensated with voting strength. This was the case soon after independence in Uganda. In the case of Uganda, the armed ethnic groups, whether in the army or not, were very apprehensive of the larger ethnic groups, especially the Baganda. Consequently, they ganged up to ensure that the Baganda's numerical strength was politically deflated. The Baganda, who were about 25% of the population of the country, are the largest ethnic group in the country. The next largest ethnic groups, the Banyankore and the Iteso, are each about 12% of the population, which means half of the Baganda. Each one is half of the Baganda population. This demography leaves the rest of the population to consist of small minority groups who feel insecure by themselves. For example, the Langi and the Acholi, who dominated the army, constitute less than 8% of the population of Uganda. This ethnic and or demographic polarization caused political tensions in the electoral process at and soon after independence. What the many ethnic minorities could not achieve through the ballot, through the ballot box, they hoped to gain it through the barrel of the gun, as we have briefly narrated above, especially in the case of the 1966 crisis. Indeed, it should be remembered that the 1966 crisis occurred less than a year before the voters of Uganda were to go to the polls in the general election. It is therefore reasonable to assume that the coup d'etat in 1966 was partly a preemptive political move on part of Obote as a shrewd, calculating politician who was extremely worried at the time about the results of the general election soon after the UPC and KY coalition had fallen asunder in 1964. Obote was certainly not assured of electoral victory in the general election. Hence, his use of the so-called military option to stay in power. This argument, as it is strengthened by two other facts. First, the general election of 1967 was officially suspended and therefore did not take place. The suspension of the election was justified on the ground that a state of emergency that existed in Uganda after 1966 crisis could not permit a free and fair general election to take place in the country. Such was Obote's convenient reasoning amidst a political crisis of his own making, whose effects he was to control in his favor. But we should also remember that Uganda, where the emergency was declared, constituted only 25% of the country's population and territory. Now, this brings us to Obote's electoral solution. Obote made some proposals to change the electoral process in order to supposedly eliminate the ethnic factor from the electorate. The second fact, which is more important, was Obote's proposals for electoral reforms designed to deal specifically with the electoral demography. The electoral reform proposals, nicknamed the 1+2, were intended to deflate the voting strength of the majority ethnic groups in the country. In this particular case, the Baganda were the largest, the target to prevent them from dominating the electoral process in the central region through their demographic strength, as they had done at the time of independence in 1962. We should also remember that at the time of the proposals, electoral reforms in Uganda had a parliamentary system under which the party with the majority of parliament in parliament was entitled to form the government. So we didn't have a presidential system at that time. In fact, the UPC-KY coalition at independence time in 1962 was formed to deal with a similar political crisis in the electoral process in the Uganda region, which had voted as a bloc, and as a result was able to determine who formed the national government at independence in 1962. Obote had those those memories clear in his mind. Obote's electoral proposals after 1966 were supposed to create a system in which each parliamentary candidate had to stand in 2 other constituencies outside his or her region, supposedly to democratize, his or her nationalistic political credentials. According to Obote's electoral proposals, for example, if a candidate with a basic constituency in Uganda lost in the other 2 secondary constituencies, that is, one in the west and another in the east and the north or east, she would not be returned to parliament to represent his or her Buganda constituency. According to the proposed system, it was conceivable that Buganda could be represented in parliament by more than 50% of the MPs from outside Buganda, and therefore non-Buganda representing Buganda, it would end up with non-Buganda representing Buganda in Buganda. Obote's electoral reforms were calculated to deflate the numerical and ethnic strength of the large ethnic groups. It is therefore obvious that after independence, the success of ethnic groups were demographically threatened by the numerical strength of large ethnic groups. Obote's proposals proposed the electoral reform, however, they were not aimed at democratizing Uganda. They were aimed at fighting ethnic wars in the ballot boxes. Fortunately, the proposals were aborted by Amin's coup d'etat of January 24th, 1971, which brought a sudden end of Obote I administration. Now, when we look at the 1980 elections, we get another picture. The first general election since independence in 1962 was held in December 1980, 22 years after independence. The electoral results of the 1980 general elections, although controversial for the serious allegations of rigging allegedly committed by Obote's group headed by Paul Mulwanga, the results did not in any way show the ethnic polarization Obote was obsessed with in the 1960s and tried to solve with his electoral proposals of 1+2 formula. 2 factors may explain the results of the 1980 general election. The first is social change, which is inevitable and necessarily, not necessarily controlled by politics. Societies do not remain static. They are constantly transformed by social change. This means that ethnic polarization in the electoral process cannot remain forever like anything else. It is subject to the laws of history and social change. Second, Democratization, by protecting the rights to associate, to assemble, and to express oneself freely, shows people allows people of different ethnic groups to join political parties and other associations. Genuine political parties are supposed to be founded on political philosophy. As a result, political parties in a democratized political system inevitably cut across ethnic lines. Therefore, even though ethnicity was initially a factor against democratization, both social change and political freedom intervened in order to break down ethnic lines in a democratized political process. We are not, of course, arguing that in 1980 Uganda had been fully democratized, or that politics was then driven by political philosophy. It had, however, achieved substantial social change in the perception of political parties and ethnicity. The demographic factor of ethnicity is therefore not a permanent obstacle to democratization. Obote's electoral proposals were not necessary to eliminate the ethnic factor. The biggest problem in this context was the suppression of political freedom by the dictatorial regimes Uganda endured. As long as political freedom is guaranteed and protected, democratization takes its course, and as a result, the numeric strength of ethnicity weakens as political parties based on political philosophy, which generates political campaigns guided by issues, begin to dominate and transform political behavior of the people. So originally, although the fears of ethnicity and the demographic factors of ethnicity, although those fears were real, they had no permanent foundation. They had no basis in the long run because of social change, and therefore the tricks which Obote wanted to play through his electoral formula of 2 + 1 + 2 were not necessary. What is necessary is to guarantee political freedom, and just when you guarantee political freedom, as we defined democracy, that's the second component of democracy. There you begin to have a political system, a political process which is driven by philosophy and not ethnicity. And if it is driven by philosophy, a Muganda who has the same philosophy as an Acholi or a Kalamajong or a Muchiga, they are going to be in the same party regardless of their ethnicity. So what we have to work hard for is to make sure that political freedom is guaranteed, and as it is, politics will be driven more by philosophy than ethnic identity. The next issue, the next factor which is important is culture. For over a century, culture has figured prominently in any study of democracy in the developing world. In fact, the culture theory produced a form of Eurocentrism under which democratization and or modernization were mistakenly equated with a form of westernization. Elements of Western culture were believed to be an inherent part of democracy. Therefore, democratization was seen as an inevitable form of westernization. The culture theory postulated that religious ethics, which produced worshipping a personal God, also the religious ethics in the West, that is, which produced worshipping a personal God, also produced the conditions for democracy, the unique conditions, that is, created in the West, like the Protestant ethic and so on. This, of course, we demonstrated in our introductory conversation that it is an invalid hypothesis. It meant that democracy is typically Western cultural product with no equivalent in other non-Western cultures. Democratization basically means, or is equivalent to, according to the culture theory, Westernization for those who believe in the culture theory. The factors that whether we have to look at the issue of whether culture does in fact is a major factor in democratization. Our methodology in this conversation will be guided by two types of inquiry. The first is to ask and find answers to empirical questions in a specific political or historical context. For example, we may ask what specific factors have caused political behavior of the people in a specific historical or political environment or system. The second line of inquiry is theoretical. In this case, the question is whether a specific political behavior was actually caused by culture. In this second inquiry, it does not matter whether the culture which influenced or caused the behavior is either Western or not. The point is to determine whether culture causes political behavior. We believe these two types of inquiry will help us to sort out the issues whether a particular political behavior was actually caused by culture or not, and if so, which culture. Hopefully this inquiry, this line of inquiry will help us to reach either a degree of scholarly nullification or verification of some of the premises on which the culture theory is founded. In Uganda, for example, we know that the colonial regime suppressed political freedom, namely the rights to associate, assemble, and to express oneself were suppressed. Political parties were not allowed to exist until the last decade of colonialism, that is, in the early 1950s. The only type of association allowed under the colonial regime was the welfare association, which served members of a particular ethnic group. Ironically, the welfare associations over time mutated into political organizations that later became political parties. This happened in most African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda also. As the suppression of political freedom was loosened, Africans in Uganda started to participate in boycott of Asian traders. Strikes of workers began to appear, and even demonstrations to express particular feelings among Africans took place. Nevertheless, the pathological fear of the state was still a formidable latent factor in the political behavior of Africans. People still remembered the brutal suppression of riots of 1945 and 1949 in Uganda, which were concentrated in Buganda, where the capital was located and was the most densely populated area in Uganda. Unlike Kenya, however, in Uganda there was no rebellion on land ownership by Africans who enjoyed plenty of land rights. As a result, no there was no brutal suppression of political activities in Uganda as there was in Kenya under Mau Mau rebellion, where the political events associated with democratization in Uganda during the 1950s, motivated or caused by culture. The major political activities during this period, especially during the last 7 or so years before independence, were occupied by commissions of inquiry and conferences on the independence constitution, in which Africans were allowed by the colonial regime to participate actively. Beginning with the Namirembe Conference in 1955, which signaled the return of the Kabaka from 2 years of exile in England, the reform and expansion of the Legico in 1957, the main political activities centered on transition to independence, with the exception of the issues of urging the position of the Kabaka in Uganda and other leaders of traditional institutions. Culture seems to me to have played no major role in the activation of political behavior of the Ugandans during the decade preceding independence in 1962. The boycott of the Asian traders in 1950s, for example, was driven largely by the unfairness of the laws regulating commerce rather than cultural motives. after independence, as we have seen in previous conversations, politics was driven by either the demography of ethnicity or military power and its ethnic composition. Culture was such, as such, does not seem to have either activated, motivated, or even inhibited political behavior. In fact, the major factor inhibiting political behavior was either pathological fear of the state, as illustrated by the events of Nakula in 1964, Mengo 66, and the attempted assassination of Obote in 1969, and the slaughter of the Acholi and others after Amin's coup in 1971. Can we argue that the failure to rebel against Amin's brutal regime was the result of cultural behavior? The answer is no. The pathological fear of the state originating from colonial rule and enhanced after independence had more to do with it than culture, because it cut across ethnic and cultural lines. This pathological fear of the state was also part of the ethnic factor in the military power equation. This explains why the Southerners did not join the war against Amin, which waged by Obote from Tanzania. But instead, they overwhelmingly supported the civil war against Obote too in Luwero Triangle between 1981 and 1986. Culture played no role in the southern reaction towards Obote 2, Obote 1 and Obote 2 regimes. This was a war fought specifically and on a democratic cause to end political oppression. Kasozi wrote about the social origins of violence in Uganda during the same period. The implication of the title of the book and its subject matter is that political violence is embedded within Ugandan culture or social fabric. This hypothesis does not seem to be borne out by the historical facts and the explanation we have given here. Culturally biased evidence did not occur at one time in pre-colonial era, but after the colonial regime pacified and incorporated the different ethnic groups into one country of Uganda, the state not only monopolized violence or the use of state power to suppress political freedom, but it also severely punished any violence between ethnic groups provoked by historical rivalries such as those between the Baganda and the Banyoro. The application of the culture theory from a historical perspective. In applying the culture theory to democratization in a non-Western country, usually the first step is to ask why a particular society or political system has not democratized. Usually the answer is to point out the unique non-Western cultural elements which are presumed to have prevented democratization in the non-Western country. An assumption is made to the effect that the local non-Western culture is the important, it is the impediment towards democratization. A good example is China, for example. Samuel P. Huntington attributes the absence of democracy in China to Confucianism, which he argues promotes respect of authority and conformity to tradition. This explanation, which sounds convincing within the context of the culture paradigm, confuses has two errors. The first error is to assume that Confucianism fully explains the absence of democracy in China. That assumption is not sociologically established. In fact, it is based on the belief that there are no dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere where Western culture has prevailed for a long time, such as Russia, Eastern Europe, Spain, or Portugal. One must wonder why these countries in the West are all in the so-called third wave of democratization as classified by Huntington. The second error is the assumption, is that to ignore the nature of the state, the state itself, because the evolution of the state, we must understand how it affected the suppression of freedom. Every state, the very margins of the concept of state entails some suppression of freedom. Moreover, the explanation of Confucianism, if we go back to China, being responsible for the absence of democracy in China, ignores an Asian democracy, which is Japan, which has similar elements of culture as China, but is progressively democratic. Our opinion, therefore, the Chinese, like the Africans, have suffered for a long time from political suppression by the state, creating over the custom with the Chinese population, pathological fear of the state. Chinese emperors, for example, were very brutal and authoritarian leaders. They were more responsible for the failure to confront the state than Confucianism. In fact, it is true that Confucianism contributed to the repression of the Chinese people by the Chinese state. Confucianism's contribution to the repression was in the form of pathological fear of the state rather than a causal factor in the political behavior of the Chinese. The main factor is pathological fear, in our opinion. This runs across the entire globe, regardless of culture. Pathological fear has been a very terrible factor in preventing democracy from evolving and thriving in almost every part of the world, even though, as we know, all these different parts of the world have different cultures. So the common denominator seems to be the pathological fear that is created by the state, by the dictatorships, which we know have existed almost in every region of the globe. We also have to remember that the state, from a historical perspective, is a relatively recent product of social evolution. By its very nature, the evolution of the state depended on the creation of fear in order to protect and preserve its authority from its enemies, both internal and external. In other words, the very process of creating the state involved some degree of creating pathological fear of the state within the population. The fear of the state reached a pathological level depending on several factors. Sometimes it was caused by the battle for power or the throne among the contending leaders or the princes. Insecurity of the leader is another factor, tends to breed brutality. In some cases, it was the personality of the leaders themselves, some of whom were actually believed to be mentally deranged. What is important to remember, however, is creating pathological fear of the state is a universal factor and not caused by particular culture. It is inherent in politics of insecurity. The people must learn to overcome it through civil society, as we shall explain in later conversations. Now, we look at the economic development, whether this is a factor that can either accelerate or delay democratization. One of the culture theory postulations is the causal connection between economic development and the process of democratization. The existence of the former is presumed to facilitate or cause the creation of the latter. The theory, that's the way the culture theory postulates. What is not clear, however, is whether the process of economic development by itself stimulates democratization, or development of the economy transforms society as a whole in such a way that the economy, the behavior of the people, of the individuals within the society begins to change towards leading to democratization. These questions and issues we have to briefly sort out in these conversations. In doing so, we have to look at a specific history of a specific political system and see if its democratization can be correlated with the phases of economic development. Moreover, the culture theory is ambivalent as to what extent the causation of historical processes may be reproduced in another culture, another cultural context or circumstances. In fact, the culture theory has been found guilty of the phenomenon of historical individualism. By historical individualism, it is meant the fact that, as Max Weber wrote, the evolution, the development of capitalism, that the Protestant ethic did produce the conditions and the norms that led to capitalism. And those conditions also eventually created the democratic system and process. Now, that means the reason why it is called individualism is it only occurred in the West and never occurred anywhere else. So that means that it occurs only once. Now, if that is so, then the theory leads to problems. How do you then say that culture is responsible for democratization, but only in one place originally? We can nevertheless look at the history of specific countries which were found ideal by the culture theorists to exemplify the suitable fertile ground for social causation and transformation by cultural rationalization that supposedly produced capitalism, the capitalist norms and institutions, which in turn created democracy. In the case of England, it is clear that the process of democratization was a gradual one lasting centuries. Unlike the U.S., where there is no specific date one can point out, when England became democratic, so as to trace the causes, with any specificity, we have to look at the details of the history of England itself. Beginning with the enactment of the Magna Carta in 1215, the Magna Carta is a great symbol of democracy ever since it was enacted, when the people demanded that the king and the state recognized certain rights that belong to the people by virtue of their humanity. And it introduced things like a trial by the jury of 1 year. Democratization in England was put on a steady course that did not seem to be dictated by economic factors. In fact, the judges, the judiciary, made democratizing judicial pronouncements based on precedents cutting down the power of the king with the new rights created under the common law, which Parliament in some cases later on endorsed or converted into legislation. Parliament, from a political perspective during the earlier phases of democratization of England, asserted itself and eventually took control over the fairness of the suppression of the cabinet, supervision of the cabinet, and by 1688 revolution and the Civil War, when Thomas Hobbes referred to life in England as short, nasty, and brutish, democratization was on a steady but gradual course. In some respects, a direct effort of the Civil War. We cannot, during that long period, covering centuries, attribute any democratization of England exclusively to economic development as an essential factor. In fact, between 1750 and 1830, the Industrial Revolution could have been as much the result of the economically stabilizing rule of law rather than the economic development unleashed by the industrialization process in England. We have to admit, however, that an industrialized economy, by its nature, creates multiple economic interests of the workers, the capitalists, the managers, and other professionals who view the political process and the economy from different perspectives. And as a result, they are motivated to participate in the political process from the different perspectives of securing their interests. The transformation of the economy contributed to the diversification of civil society. There's no doubt about that. This brings us to the Chinese example once again, but from a different point of view. By 2010, China had achieved a substantial amount of industrialization in the economy. That is economic development without initiating compatible democratization in the political system at the same time. Is this a chicken and egg conundrum? It is possible for some to argue that the economic development in China is concentrated in the large urban centers, and therefore the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people live in rural areas, and therefore they have not been infected by the industrialization virus that could make them behave differently politically. That argument, however, is lame. India, which is a neighbor to China, has a similar demographics and economic development as China, but India has been successfully democratizing its system since independence in 1947. Looking at what happened in England, what is going on in China, and what is happening in India has achieved, seems to suggest that the culture theory postulation of the causal relationship between economic development and democratization is not supported by contemporary and historical experience of democratization. Scholarly nullification of our conclusion is, however, pending confirmation. When we look closely at the contemporary Arab world, another perspective confirming our tentative conclusion emerges. The Arab countries like Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and the others have a much higher GDP than African countries like South Africa, Botswana, Ghana, and the Cape Verde Islands. These African countries whose economies are less developed and poorer than the Arab countries cited above are more democratic than the Arab countries with such a much higher GDP. Well, of course, we define democracy. You have to remember our definition, which we started with last week, with the 6 components. That's where our comparison comes from. Higher GDP does not therefore seem to yield or translate into democratization automatically. Civil society must first be created before democratization takes place. Libya especially is especially interesting. Not only did the Libyan economy achieve substantial development from oil wealth, but the state provided generous benefits to all its citizens, such as housing, supplementing the incomes, and building modern infrastructure. Political power in Libya, however, was far more absolutely monopolized by Gaddafi, his family and friends, than the monarch Gaddafi overthrew in 1969 for being, quote-unquote, inhumane. Political freedom under Gaddafi was absolutely repressed under the so-called Jamahiriya. The level of economic development did not cause a revolution in Libya. It was not until the revolutions of the people in Tunisia and Egypt toppled the dictators in those countries that the Libyan population, or segment of it for that matter, decided to riot and demand rights protected, and eventually, with the help from the NATO Air Force, overthrew